Hello, my name is David Winch. I'm a chartered accountant and a director of Bartfields Forensic Accountants. And today we're doing about 30 minutes on some leading case law in confiscation. So let's crack on with an agenda. There's going to be a brief introduction, and then I'm going to talk about what confiscation is and what it is not. A little bit about It's All About Me, which refers to a case of Jennings. Benefit jointly obtained, evasion and a pecuniary advantage, and then how we at Bartfields Forensic Accountants can help. As I said, this session is on some confiscation case law. There is an awful lot of confiscation case law, and there's an awful lot of important confiscation case law. We can only scratch the surface in half an hour. And I'm going to concentrate particularly on perhaps the leading case involving a gentleman called Mr. May. So we'll spend some time on that because there's a lot of key principles covered there, which we will find useful. Okay, so we're just going to talk basics and fundamentals in confiscation. And in a fortnight's time, I will go into some other case law and some other important cases that I haven't time to cover today. The statute we're dealing with, of course, is the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002. And that was built on the history of previous statutes going back to the 1980s, which dealt with confiscation initially in cases of drug-related crime, and then shortly thereafter in cases of general crime in which a benefit had been obtained. A lot of the case law under those earlier statutes is still relevant, but we have to exercise some care because some things have changed as we moved into POCA 2002. And so some of the old cases are not particularly relevant. A good place to start, as I've mentioned, is the case of May, a House of Lords case. What was the name of the Supreme Court before its name changed. And the cases which I'm going to mention are all available freely on the web if you don't have access to a paid subscription on the Bailey website, which stands for British and Irish Legal Information Institute, or something like that. Okay, so let's start looking at the case of Mr. May in 2008. It was actually a case based on the provisions of the Criminal Justice Act of 1988, the confiscation provisions there. And it was a VAT missing trader fraud in which Mr. May was one of the conspirators. He was convicted of conspiracy to defraud or conspiracy to cheat. It was said that there was over £11 million lost to Revenue and Customs as a result of this conspiracy. Mr. May wasn't a member of it from day one, and his benefit and his confiscation order was something over £3 million. This was not a criminal lifestyle case. It was not a case in which the prosecution had relied on the statutory assumptions under the Criminal Justice Act of 1988, which we know as the criminal lifestyle assumptions under POCA. And for that reason, there wasn't a particular emphasis on criminal lifestyle in the case of May. There wasn't a particular emphasis on statutory assumptions. And today, I'm actually not dealing with the statutory assumptions very much indeed at all. So we'll come on to those in a fortnight's time. So, the big but, the court in May, the Supreme Court as we would call it today, took the opportunity to discuss more widely confiscation issues. Perhaps some of the things they said were obiter, strictly speaking, but as we know, we take very serious account of whatever the Supreme Court says, even where it's obiter. It was incidentally a unanimous judgment, it was May. There is in the judgment a lengthy discussion of the history of earlier confiscation cases. And May sets out a sort of a structure which is developed in later judgments. It's perhaps tweaked a little bit in later judgments. One gets the impression that the Supreme Court does not want to unsay anything that has been said previously. Of course, technically it can overrule itself, but it clearly doesn't rush to do that. And in the later judgments that we will discuss in a fortnight's time, there has been some refinement of the principles and structure that we find in May, but there hasn't been anything taken away from May. There hasn't been any occasion that I'm aware of, at least, where the Supreme Court has said, we got it wrong in May. They've merely said what follows from May and what we were meaning was this. But as I've said, criminal lifestyle wasn't relevant in the case of May, and criminal lifestyle issues are not particularly explored in May. It is mentioned briefly, but it's not the focus of the case. On the same day that the court dealt with Mr. May's case, it also dealt with two other confiscation cases, one involving Mr. Jennings and another of Mr. Green. And so the three judgments were handed down together, dealing with different aspects. Most of them were covered in May. There's a couple of points in Jennings which I will mention later. One of the things they said in May was what confiscation is. And they said this, the legislation, this is pretty much a quote from the judgment in May, the legislation is intended to deprive defendants of the benefit they have gained from criminal conduct, whether or not they have retained such benefit. So it's not benefit retained, it's benefit obtained, which is relevant to confiscation, but within the limits of their available means. And that kind of encapsulates, in a few brief words, the thrust of confiscation. So we're looking at the defendant's benefit, what he's obtained, including, of course, assumed benefit, as we know, where the assumptions apply. But then we look at the defendant's available amount, and the amount that he's required to pay in a confiscation order is going to be the lower of his benefit and his available amount. And that's what the House of Lords were getting at when they said within the limits of their available means. We can't order a defendant to pay money which he doesn't have with a default sentence attached to it, because that simply is imprisonment by another name. So what we're saying is that we are dealing with what he has available to pay. And of course, that's subject to variation later, but that's a different story. The benefit gained is the total value of the property or advantage obtained. By advantage, we're talking about a pecuniary advantage. By property, we're talking about property, meaning any sort of asset, tangible, intangible, shows in action, all of those sort of things, they're all property. And the benefit gained is not the defendant's net profit after deduction of expenses. It's not the defendant's share of a benefit which he obtains and then passes on to co-conspirators. It is the whole of the amount the defendant obtained. Now again, there is some qualification of that in later cases. What confiscation is not, again, this is pretty much a quote from the judgment in May. The legislation does not provide for confiscation in the sense understood by school children and others. So we're not, in confiscation, we're not taking from the defendant the particular asset that he's acquired from his criminality. We're taking from him the value of the benefit he obtained. But it also does not operate by way of a fine. And in that sense, it is not a punishment it is simply trying to deprive him of the benefit he has obtained. Although clearly it is part of a sentence and it is a deterrent. I've heard confiscation described as a deterrent penalty. I think most defendants would struggle to differentiate a deterrent penalty from a fine, but the basic logic behind it is, as we've said, depriving the defendant of the benefit he's obtained, not punishing him by fining him. There were 3 questions posed in the case of May. They said, again, I'm quoting from the judgment pretty much, the court should proceed by asking 3 separate questions. And it does suggest, and well, more than suggest, that these questions do need to be considered separately. Has the defendant benefited from relevant criminal conduct? That's question 1. If he has, what is the value of the benefit he has obtained? And then lastly, what sum is recoverable from him? And of course, that will be affected by his available amount. However, under section 6 of POCA, there is perhaps a prior question to be answered, which wasn't particularly addressed in May, and it's this: does the defendant have a criminal lifestyle? If we look at the structure of section 6, subsection 4 asks that question first. The court has to find whether the defendant has a criminal lifestyle. If he does, then it needs to identify the benefit of his general criminal conduct, and that may well involve the assumptions. If he does not, then the assumptions don't apply, and we're looking at the benefit of his particular criminal conduct only. Of course, to answer the question, does the defendant have a criminal lifestyle, you actually have to determine how much benefit he's obtained from the offences, or you may have to. Again, if we get into the detail of section 75, and we've covered this in a previous webinar, the criminal lifestyle questions, 1 or 2 of the routes involve the question of, is the benefit which the defendant has obtained at least £5,000? So if we were drawing a flow chart of this sort of question, it would have some loops and circles in it, I think, because we have to determine the amount of benefit before we can decide whether we've got a criminal lifestyle. We have to determine the criminal lifestyle before we can decide how much the benefit is. But I think in practice, it's not as difficult as it sounds in theory. So, in addressing these questions, the court must first establish the facts as best it can on the material available. And in many cases, as the Lord said in May, in many cases, the factual findings will be decisive. Importantly, they said the court should focus very closely on the language of the statutory provision in question in the context of the statute and in the light of any statutory definition. And sometimes prosecutors, I think, get carried away a little bit with what they think confiscation is about and what they think confiscation is intended to achieve. And they set about achieving that without perhaps focusing sufficiently on the actual statute and the limitations of confiscation in statute. And those are crucial. The court said guidance should ordinarily be sought in the statutory language rather than, as they called it, rather than in the proliferating case law. Well, case law has proliferated rather a lot more since May was decided. In determining, they said, under the 2002 Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, whether the defendant has obtained property or a pecuniary advantage, and if so, the value of any property or advantage so obtained, the court should, subject to any relevant statutory definition, apply ordinary common law principles to the facts as found. So what they're saying is that confiscation isn't different from every other sort of law. It is applying the law as we understand it with regard to ownership of property and matters such as that. Of course, years ago, before POCA 2002, there were various questions which were determined in the High Court rather than the Crown Court. And the reason for that may be that the High Court was more used to dealing with issues of property and ownership and valuation. The exercise of this jurisdiction, they said, involves no departure from familiar rules governing entitlement and ownership. A defendant ordinarily obtains property, they said, if in law he owns it, whether alone or jointly. So, whilst joint ownership is important, joint ownership is ownership. It's not simply a matter of if some property passes by you, you obtain it if you don't own it. And they said ownership, obtaining property and ownership will ordinarily connote a power of disposition or control. So that you may own some property in the sense of being able to direct, let's say, being able to direct your solicitor to pay it to somebody on your instructions. If you're in a position to control, you have freedom to control monies in that way, even though they haven't actually come into your hand, so to speak, you will have obtained them. We have to be a little bit careful here because we know from a case of Weyer, which we're not going to discuss this week, we know from the case of Weyer that where a solicitor is holding a mortgage advance, for example, he doesn't own it, he doesn't hold it under instruction from the defendant, he holds it under instruction from the lender. And so the defendant doesn't obtain that mortgage advance in those circumstances. But that's a different issue. We'll deal with that perhaps in a fortnight. With regard to pecuniary advantage, a defendant ordinarily obtains a pecuniary advantage, they said, if, among other things, he evades a liability to which he is personally subject. And that is important, to which he is personally subject. Mere couriers or custodians of other very minor contributors to an offence, rewarded by a specific fee and having no interest in the property or the proceeds of sale, are unlikely to be found to have obtained that property. So if, for example, I agree to carry a kilo of cocaine, let's say, on behalf of somebody else in exchange for a £100 fee, then I don't obtain that cocaine. I'm merely holding it and carrying it for somebody else. What I obtain from that is the £100 fee. And that's going to be my benefit for confiscation purposes in those circumstances. Now, of course, it does depend in any particular case on the actual facts of the case. So we shouldn't generalize too much, but that's the issue that the House of Lords were pointing to here. They said the answering of the first two questions, which you remember, the first two questions is, has the defendant obtained property? And if so, how much? Call for a historical inquiry into past transactions. The answering of the third question of the recoverable amount calls for inquiry into the financial resources of the defendant at the date of the determination. So when we're in the confiscation hearing and we're asking about the available amount of the defendant, we're asking about his available amount today. We're not asking about assets which he received in the past and monies which he spent in the past, with the caveat that we do have to consider any tainted gifts which may have been made in the past. And the whole issue of what is a tainted gift is a separate statutory issue. But generally speaking, in terms of available amount, the focus is on where we are now, not the history of the defendant. Whereas in terms of looking at the defendant's benefit, we are looking at the history of his conduct in committing the offences. We're looking in a criminal lifestyle case at the history of property transferred to him since the relevant day, expenditure incurred since the relevant day, and we're also, of course, looking at assets held since the date of conviction under the assumptions. Okay. I mentioned that the case of Jennings was decided on the same day, and the judgments, of course, are totally consistent. And they said in Jennings, a person benefits from an offence if he obtains property as a result of or in connection with its commission. That's what the statute says. But they said that must be read as meaning obtained by him. So it's important, if we've got a case in which there are several co-defendants, they can all be convicted, let's say, of a conspiracy. That's fine. But then when it comes to confiscation, we have to look at each of them individually. We don't do a single confiscation covering them all. We confiscate against each of them individually. I did once see a Section 16 statement drawn up by somebody who'd actually included two defendants in the same statement and had joined together the benefits obtained by each of them and had joined together the available amount that each of them had and was trying to ask the court to make a single confiscation order against them both, covering their joint available amount. That's just not how confiscation works. We had to send that Section 16 back, in effect, and say, please try again. So yeah, we're looking at, in confiscation, we're looking at one defendant at a time, and we're looking at the property obtained by him. In the ordinary way, the court said in Jennings, in the ordinary way, acts done in the name of and on the behalf of a limited company are treated in law as the acts of the company, not of the individuals who do them. But the case of Jennings involved a wholly fraudulent company. The company had no legitimate business at all. It was simply set up as a means to operate a scam. And the defendant, Paul Jennings, was not permitted, as it were, to hide behind the company's identity and protect himself from confiscation by pointing to the company and away from himself. The House of Lords went as far as to say, in the case of Jennings, the veil of incorporation has not so much been pierced as rudely torn away. And it is important for piercing the corporate veil cases, as we've discussed in a previous webinar, it is important to establish whether there is an underlying legitimate business of the company or not. In the case of Mr. Jennings and his company, no, there was no legitimate business. It was simply a fraudulent exercise from the beginning. Benefit obtained jointly. I've said that benefit might be obtained individually or jointly. How do we deal with the same benefit obtained jointly by more than one defendant? Well, that was addressed by the Supreme Court in 2014 in the case of Ahmad. And what they said was pretty straightforward and pretty clear, but sometimes misunderstood. Where there is a finding of joint obtaining, whether against a single defendant or more than one, the confiscation order should be made against each defendant for the whole value of the benefit thus obtained. So if myself and a friend steal a painting worth £100,000 and make off with it, and we're caught, convicted, and confiscation comes around, each of us has a benefit of £100,000. We don't have a benefit of half a painting, or we don't have a benefit of £50,000. We have, each of us have a benefit of £100,000. But if it were left there, the state might be able to recover £100,000 from each of us, and actually therefore recover in total £200,000 in relation to an offence involving £100,000. And that doesn't make sense. So in Armand, the Supreme Court said this: the confiscation order should be made against each defendant for the whole of the value of the defendant of the benefit, thus obtained, but should provide that it is not to be enforced to the extent that a sum has been recovered by way of satisfaction of another confiscation order made, and this is the important bit, made in relation to the same joint benefit. So if myself and my friend have stolen this painting valued at £100,000, we each have a confiscation order against us in the sum of £100,000. But at the end of the day, the state is going to recover only £100,000 and not £200,000 in confiscation from the pair of us. Well, who pays, him or me? Well, the Supreme Court said, as criminals, we have to take the rough with the smooth. If it so happens that I have money and my friend does not, and I finish up paying the whole £100,000 and he pays nothing, so be it. On the subject of pecuniary advantage, the key question for the court is which defendant is personally liable. This was the case of White and others, and it involved some duty which had been evaded on goods, I think there were cigarettes, brought into the country. And the question was, which of the defendants is actually liable for the duty? And that depended on a careful reading of the regulations and a careful examination of the facts of when the goods actually entered the UK and who had control of them at that time. And the key question, as I say, in White and others, was which of these defendants were personally liable for the duty evaded? The court accepted that it depended upon the detail of the tax and duty regulations, and that depending on those regulations and on the particular facts of the importation, there might be more than one person personally liable, in which case we'd have this jointly obtained benefit situation. A similar question arose on pecuniary advantage in the case of Powell and Wood. And this involved a company that was dealing with waste, or more accurately, was not dealing with waste properly and caused environmental pollution. It was a limited company that was in the business, and Powell, I believe, was the director. I'm not sure if Westwood was, but both of them were convicted of either connivance in the breach of environmental regulations or in neglect in allowing the breach of environmental regulations, and they were subject to confiscation. All well and good. When it came to the confiscation, the Crown said the company went bust, didn't clean up the mess that it had left, the government had to clean up the mess, and it cost over £1 million to clean the mess up. The directors had pleaded guilty to offences of allowing this to happen or causing it to happen. Cleanup costs were over £1 million. So clearly, said the Crown, that's advantage. That's a pecuniary advantage in that they have avoided this liability for £1 million. That should be part of their benefit for confiscation purposes. No, said the Court of Appeal. These costs are not part of benefit of the convicted individuals, And the reason that they are not costs and not part of the benefit of those individuals is because those individuals were not personally liable for them. The company would have been personally liable, but the company had gone bust. The directors were not personally liable for those costs, and therefore they were not benefit in their confiscation proceedings. Okay, that's a half hour's quick run through of some cases. We will do more in a fortnight's time, but in the meantime, let me remind you that Bartfields Forensic Accountants is fully staffed, undertaking legally aided and privately funded criminal and civil forensic accountancy work. We are coping very well in the pandemic. We're acting remotely, working via our up-to-date and secure IT facilities, and we remain readily contactable by phone, by email, and online. The website is full of useful information and, of course, is accessible 24/7. More on this topic can be found on the website at www.bartfieldsforensic.co.uk. If you look under Insights News, you will find the blog of these topics, and this webinar and previous ones, again, can be found on the website. The details are there. We will send you a free recording of this webinar. And if you've got any questions, probably the easiest way is to email them in, and the email addresses are there. We will happily answer any questions that you have. I've run slightly over my 30 minutes. Apologies for that. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll see you again in a fortnight. Thank you.